Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we journey far, far back to a time before castles dotted the Irish landscape, to a world governed by ancient laws and social contracts you'll find absolutely baffling. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the flickering light of a peat fire in a great hall, the shadows dancing on the faces of men and women gathered in a circle. You're there. You can smell the smoke, the damp wool of their cloaks, and the faint coppery scent of ale. In this world, a simple insult or a broken promise could carry a punishment so strange, so deeply rooted in the supernatural and the social, that it seems more like a fairy tale curse than a legal verdict. It's a place where your very honour is a tangible, valuable commodity, and losing it is often worse than losing your life. A place where a judge might punish you not with a prison sentence. They didn't have those, by the way, but by making you an outcast, a ghost in your own community. You probably won't survive this social experiment, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the early medieval Irish countryside, a landscape of rolling green hills and stone forts. This isn't a world of Roman legions or elaborate bureaucracies. This is a world built on a complex web of familial and communal bonds, and at the heart of it all is a legal system so unique it's almost alien to our modern sensibilities. It's the Brehon laws, and it's the foundation of everything we're about to explore. You don't have a king in a big, distant palace making all the rules. Instead, you have the Brehon, the Bratham in Old Irish, who is a sort of legal scholar and judge all rolled into one, but crucially, he doesn't enforce the law. He just declares it. Think of it this way. The Brehon is like a living, walking encyclopedia of legal precedents, genealogies and traditions. He knows the honour prices of every noble family in the land, the penalties for stealing a cow versus a goat, and the exact rituals for settling a boundary dispute. You come to him with a problem, and he gives you the verdict. But there's no police force to drag you off to jail if you don't like his decision. Instead, the power of the law rests on something far more fundamental: the fear of social and supernatural retribution. Central to this whole system is the concept of an oath. Now, forget everything you know about a modern courtroom oath, where you swear on a Bible to tell the truth. In ancient Ireland, an oath was a far more serious, sacred and terrifying thing. When you swore an oath, you weren't just promising to a judge. You were calling upon the very gods, the land and your ancestors to bear witness to your words. You might swear on a sacred stone, the sun and moon, or even the very weapons of your chieftain. The oath wasn't just a promise, it was a contract with the universe itself. Breaking an oath was not just a legal violation, it was a cosmic one. It was believed that if you swore falsely, the consequences wouldn't just fall on you. The land itself might become barren, the cattle might sicken, your family could be struck with bad luck for generations. This wasn't just a superstition, it was a powerful social deterrent. No one wanted to be the person who brought a curse down on their entire community because they fibbed about stealing a few sheep. This fear created a legal framework where a person's word, sealed by an oath, was often all the evidence you needed. It was a beautiful and deeply terrifying system of accountability. There's a mainstream historical fact here that's absolutely vital. The Brehon laws were almost entirely unwritten for centuries, passed down orally from one generation of legal scholars to the next. They were meticulously memorized and chanted in poetic verses, and the Brehons were highly trained specialists, often from a specific lineage of judges. It's an incredible feat of memory and scholarship, especially when you consider that these laws governed everything from property rights to divorce. The lack of a central written code meant the laws were flexible, adapting to local customs and precedents, but it also made the Brehons' knowledge and integrity paramount. Now, let's get into a quirky tidbit. There's a fascinating detail about the type of oath you could swear. In some cases, a person could swear an oath by their own body. They might place their hand on a part of their own body and curse that part if they lied. For example, a man might swear by his eye and say, "May this eye be put out if I speak falsely." This wasn't just a figure of speech. It was a literal physical contract with the divine. It was believed that if you lied, you would in fact go blind. Imagine a legal system where every time you went to court, you put a part of your own body on the line. It adds a certain weight to the phrase, swearing on your life, doesn't it? This brings us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the physical punishments and curses associated with broken oaths were taken literally, or if they were a form of highly effective social pressure. Did people truly believe a lie would physically maim them, or was the fear of being seen as a dishonourable, oath-breaking person so great that they would never risk it? It's a chicken and egg situation. The fear of divine retribution was so strong that people simply didn't dare to lie under oath, so the curse was never tested. The social shame of being known as an oath-breaker might have been the real punishment all along, but the supernatural threat gave that shame its teeth. So you see, the foundation of this society isn't a courthouse and a jail. It's a brehon with a memory like a steel trap, a community that watches your every move, and a deep, abiding belief in the power of a spoken promise. A broken oath was not just a crime, it was an act of social and spiritual suicide. It stripped you of your honour, and as we'll see, that was the most terrifying punishment of all. In a world where your standing was everything, where your word was your bond, and where the land itself was a witness to your deeds, the most bizarre punishments often didn't involve physical pain, but a deep fundamental stripping away of your place in the world. It's a concept that we, with our modern legal systems and impersonal contracts, can barely wrap our heads around. But in ancient Ireland, it was the only thing that held society together. So you're standing in this ancient world, having just seen how a simple oath held a society together, not through force, but through fear of cosmic backlash. Now, let's take a walk down a muddy track, past a few wattle and daub houses, and into the heart of the community. Because in a world without prisons, without police, the most potent weapon in the legal arsenal was often something far simpler and more insidious: public humiliation. You see, your reputation wasn't just about how others saw you, it was the very currency of your life. It dictated who would trade with you, who would marry you, and who would stand by you in a fight. Losing it was a form of social death, a fate some considered worse than the grave. The Brehon laws understood this implicitly. While they did sometimes prescribe physical fines, like a number of cows or pigs to be paid as restitution, the more creative and, frankly, more psychologically damaging punishments often involved public shaming. This wasn't just a stern talking to in front of a few neighbours. This was a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to broadcast your transgression to everyone who mattered. It was a punishment that you carried with you, not just for a day, but for a lifetime. Imagine you're the one who has committed a crime. Let's say you've been caught stealing a neighbour's tools. The brehon delivers his verdict. The sentence isn't to be locked away. No, that would be counterproductive. You'd just be a drain on the community. Instead, you're forced to wear a symbol of your crime. Maybe it's a broken tool tied to your neck with a piece of rough rope. Or perhaps you're made to carry the stolen object through the community for a full day, walking from settlement to settlement, your crime literally hanging around your neck for all to see. The humiliation is palpable. You trudge along, your head down, as people whisper and point. You're not just a man anymore, you're the thief who stole the tools. That label sticks. Every time you try to trade for grain, every time you try to join the communal feast, someone will remember the day you wore the shame of your crime. One of the more famous forms of this public shaming involved a punishment known as the fiach, or honour price. We'll get more into this in the next section, but for now, know this. Your honour was a quantifiable thing, a monetary value tied to your status. When you committed a crime, you didn't just owe restitution for the stolen goods, you also owed a fine to the victim's honour. But what if you couldn't pay? The brehon might order you to stand in the centre of the community assembly, and there you'd be publicly branded as someone who couldn't, or wouldn't, uphold their social obligations. It was a scarlet letter, but one made of social condemnation rather than a physical mark. A mainstream historical fact about this period is that the concept of a prison as a place of punishment simply didn't exist in ancient Ireland. Imprisonment was only used for holding people until a trial could be held or a fine paid, never as a punishment in and of itself. The idea of locking someone up to rehabilitate them or to make them pay their debt to society is a modern invention. The ancient Irish were far more practical. An imprisoned man was a useless man, a mouth to feed that provided no labour. It was much more efficient to fine him, shame him, or banish him, so that he could either make restitution or be someone else's problem. This lack of prisons is a defining feature of the brehon legal system, and explains why their punishments were so focused on social and economic consequences. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. There's some evidence that for certain crimes, a person might be forced to wear a collar made of straw. It sounds harmless, doesn't it? A bit like a Halloween costume. But in a society where symbolic acts held profound meaning, this was a devastating gesture. Straw was often associated with poverty, outcasts, and the unkempt. To be forced to wear a straw collar was to be publicly declared as less than human, as a feral or uncultured person. It was an incredibly potent form of visual shorthand for your disgrace, visible to anyone from a distance. The shame of that simple object would follow you for the rest of your days. You wouldn't just be that guy with the straw collar for a week. That's who you were now, forever etched into the collective memory of the community. It was a punishment that didn't fade. And here we come to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the amount of public shaming was determined by the severity of the crime or the social standing of the offender. For instance, would a high-ranking chieftain face a more humiliating and public punishment for the same crime as a common farmer? Or would the fine be so large for the chieftain that the shaming wasn't even necessary? On one hand, a chieftain's reputation was far more valuable, and thus more could be lost. On the other hand, the law was meant to be impartial, at least in theory. Was the public shaming a tool used more often on the lower classes who couldn't afford to pay fines, or was it a potent weapon reserved for the mighty to demonstrate that no one, not even the most powerful, was above the law? The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle, but it's a fascinating question about the true nature of justice in this ancient hierarchical world. Think about the psychology of it all. You're not being punished by some impersonal state apparatus. You're being punished by your neighbours, your family members, the people you see every day. The shame is a constant, suffocating blanket. It's in the way the local blacksmith looks away when you try to get your plough mended. It's in the way the baker gives your loaf of bread to someone else first, even though you were in line. It's in the way your own children might be teased by other kids. There's no escaping it. You can't just move to a new town and start over, not really. This isn't a world of anonymous metropolises. Everyone knows everyone, and word travels fast. The punishment isn't just about a single act of humiliation. It's about the relentless, grinding social consequences that ripple out from it, affecting every aspect of your life. The Brehan laws were a masterclass in using social pressure as a form of social control. They knew that a person without a good reputation was, for all intents and purposes, a person with nothing. And so the punishments were designed to take away the one thing that mattered most, your standing among your peers. This is the backdrop against which all other punishments, even the more bizarre ones we'll cover, must be seen. They all operate on the principle that the community is the ultimate arbiter of justice. The Brehan makes the ruling, but the community enforces it, not with handcuffs, but with silence, with pointed fingers, with exclusion. You trudge on, feeling the weight of that invisible scarlet letter, and you know, with a cold certainty, that your punishment has only just begun. It's a system that, for all its strangeness, was incredibly effective at maintaining order, but it came at a terrible cost to the individuals who fell afoul of it. You're still standing there, a witness to the devastating power of public shame. You've seen how a whispered word or a pointed finger can be more effective than a locked cell. Now, let's shift our attention to what happens when you're on the receiving end of a punishment that isn't just about shame, but about something far more tangible, your honour price. Because in ancient Ireland, your honour wasn't just a feeling, it was a number. It was a quantifiable value, an amount of money or livestock that represented your status in society. And when you committed a crime, you weren't just stealing a thing, you were also damaging someone else's honour, and that damage had to be paid for. This concept, known as enach in Old Irish, or honour price, is perhaps the most fundamental principle of the Brehan laws. It's the engine that drives the entire system of restitution. Forget the idea of an eye for an eye. The ancient Irish were far more concerned with restoring the balance that had been upset by a crime. If you stole a cow from your neighbour, the Brehan wouldn't just say, "Give the cow back." The Brehan would calculate the honour price of the victim, add the value of the cow, and then prescribe a fine, often in livestock, that you had to pay to the victim. This wasn't about punishing you for the sake of punishment, it was about making the victim whole again, both materially and socially. The fine was often a multiple of the original damage, to make sure the lesson was learned and the victim felt their honour had been fully restored. Your honour price wasn't static, it was based on your social status. A king had a massive honour price, worth hundreds of cows. A noble had a high price, perhaps dozens of cows. A farmer had a lower price, and a wandering bard might have had a very small one, or even none at all if they were an outcast. The value of your life was literally tied to your social standing. This is why a crime against a noble carried a far greater penalty than the same crime against a commoner. It wasn't just about the act, it was about the social ripple effect of that act. Committing a crime against a high-ranking person was a bigger affront to the social order itself. So you've committed a crime, and the brehon has delivered the verdict. You must pay a fine, the enach, to the victim. But what if you don't have the cows? What if you're a poor farmer who barely has enough to feed your family? This is where the punishment gets particularly interesting and cruel. If you couldn't pay the full restitution, you weren't just let off the hook. Instead, you could be forced into a form of indentured servitude to the victim until the debt was paid off. You would have to work their fields, tend their animals, and live under their roof, essentially becoming their property for a time. It was a punishment that didn't just make you pay for your crime, it made you pay with your time, your labour, and your freedom. And it was a punishment that, once again, was highly visible to the entire community. You were no longer your own man. You were the one who couldn't pay his debts. A mainstream historical fact is that the value of an honour price was codified in the Brehon law tracts. These texts laid out in excruciating detail the exact fines and honour prices for every imaginable crime and social standing. The legal scholars of the time memorised these intricate tables, able to cite the exact value of a broken arm inflicted on a noble versus a commoner, or the fine for stealing a beehive versus a horse. The system was a marvel of legal precision, a complex matrix of compensation designed to prevent feuds and maintain social stability. It's a testament to the sophistication of their legal thought, even without the presence of a centralised government. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a fascinating provision in the Brehon laws that deals with the honour price of an animal. An animal, like a pet dog or a horse, also had its own honour price, a value that could be paid if it was killed or injured. But here's the interesting part. The owner of the animal also had to pay a fine to the community if their animal caused harm. If your dog bit someone, you didn't just pay the victim's medical costs, you also had to pay a fine to the community for the disruption and danger your dog caused. It was a bizarre kind of double jeopardy where even the animals were held to a certain standard of behaviour, and their owners were ultimately responsible for their every action. It's a level of legal detail that makes you wonder what kind of problems they were dealing with on a daily basis. And here's an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the concept of restitution was truly about making the victim whole, or if it was just a clever way for the powerful to maintain their power. Did the system genuinely seek to restore balance? Or was it a method for a chieftain to enrich himself at the expense of a poorer farmer who couldn't pay a fine and had to become a servant? Some scholars argue that the system was fundamentally fair, a way of preventing cycles of revenge and bloodshed. Others contend that it was inherently biased, a tool of the powerful to reinforce the social hierarchy. It's a question that gets to the heart of what justice meant in this ancient world, and whether it was about fairness or about maintaining the status quo. So you see, the enach was more than just a fine. It was a social contract, a promise that if you wronged someone, you would have to pay to restore their honour. It was a system that valued social standing above all else, where your worth as a person could be measured in cows, pigs, or silver. And if you couldn't pay that debt, the punishment wasn't a cold cell and a key. It was a form of temporary slavery, a complete stripping away of your independence and your dignity. You became a living, breathing testament to the fact that you had broken the social contract, and the shame of that would follow you long after the debt was paid. The Brehon laws were a masterpiece of social engineering, a legal system built not on physical confinement, but on the relentless pressure of debt, shame, and the ever-present threat of losing the one thing that mattered most, your honour. You've witnessed the crushing weight of public humiliation and the complex mathematics of the honour price. You're beginning to understand that in ancient Ireland, the most severe punishments weren't about physical pain, but about stripping you of your place in society. Now, let's consider what happens when that stripping isn't temporary. What happens when your punishment isn't just about losing your reputation or your possessions, but about losing everything and everyone you've ever known. We're talking about the ultimate punishment in a communal society, banishment and social exile. Imagine you've committed a crime so egregious, so disruptive to the social fabric, that no amount of restitution or public shame is deemed enough. Maybe it's a repeated theft, a violent act that can't be settled with an honour price, or perhaps a betrayal of your chieftain. The Brehon makes his final, terrible pronouncement. It's not a fine, and it's not indentured servitude. The verdict is simply this: you must leave. You're declared an outlaw, a person with no legal protection and no place in the community. You are cut off, severed from the web of kinship and patronage that has defined your entire life. This wasn't just a physical banishment from a particular settlement. It was a social death sentence. In ancient Ireland, your identity was inextricably linked to your tuath, your tribe or community, your family, your kin, your chieftain. These were the people who protected you, who stood with you in a dispute, who provided you with land to farm and a place to sleep. To be banished from this system was to be erased. You no longer had the right to own property. Your debts and obligations were nullified, but so were your rights and protections. Anyone could harm you, steal from you, or even kill you, and there would be no legal recourse, no Brehon to hear your case. You were, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. You trudge out of the familiar valley, a lone figure with a small bag of possessions, your family unable to even say a proper goodbye without risking their own social standing. The familiar faces turn away. The very people who once shared a fire with you now pretend you don't exist. You are a man without a tribe, a shadow wandering the wilderness. The punishment isn't a quick, violent end. It's a slow, grinding dissolution of your very being. You're forced to wander from place to place, always on the fringes, always looking over your shoulder. You become a beggar, a robber, or a solitary hunter, but you are never again a member of a community. The landscape of your life has become a permanent exile. A mainstream historical fact is that the concept of outlawry was a recognised legal status in the Brehon laws. The term fuidir was often used to describe someone who had lost their original tribal status and was living on the fringes of society, often as a landless tenant or an outcast. These individuals had a significantly lower legal status and fewer rights than a free member of the tuath. Banishment was the formal and most severe way of creating such a person. It was a final resort, used when an individual was seen as a threat to the stability of the entire community, and the only solution was to remove them entirely. Now, for a quirky tidbit, there's a fascinating detail about what might happen if an outlaw returned. If a banished man, for whatever reason, dared to come back into the lands of his former tribe, he could be killed on sight with impunity. But here's the catch. The person who killed him had to make sure they did it in a specific way. They had to publicly declare the killing and explain why they had done it. They weren't just a vigilante. They were an agent of the law, carrying out a legal sentence. This act was often done to prevent a blood feud. By making the killing a public, legally sanctioned event, the community was essentially saying, this is not a murder. This is the enforcement of the Brehon's verdict. Sags. It turned a potentially messy act of revenge into a cold, legalistic procedure, which is a surprisingly modern way of thinking about things. And here we come to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the punishment of banishment was truly a death sentence or if it was an opportunity for a man to find a new life elsewhere. Did a banished man often just wander into another tuath and start a new life, albeit with a lower status? Or was the stigma so great that it was virtually impossible to be taken in by a new community? On one hand, the vast, sparsely populated Irish landscape would have offered plenty of places to hide. On the other hand, the close-knit, kinship-based nature of society meant that a person with no family or tribal connections was a deeply suspicious figure. The Brehon laws of one community were likely known to the Brehons of another. It's hard to imagine that word wouldn't travel, and the reputation of an outlaw wouldn't follow him wherever he went. The punishment might not have been a quick death, but a long, slow decay, a life lived in constant fear and solitude. You trudge on, feeling the raw wind on your face, the weight of your aloneness pressing down on you. You've lost not just your home, but your name. The memories of the communal fire, the laughter, the shared meals, they feel like they belong to another person. You are now a ghost, a remnant of a life that once was. Banishment was a brilliant and brutal punishment because it struck at the very core of what it meant to be a person in this world. It wasn't about taking your life. It was about taking your very identity and leaving you to wander a world that had no place for you. It was a fate so terrible, so final, that it made all other punishments seem almost merciful by comparison. You're a man without a past, a man with no future, and the vast green landscape of Ireland stretches out before you, offering no comfort, no solace, and no hope. You're wandering the fringes now, a solitary figure, the taste of social exile still bitter on your tongue. The shame and the honour price are a fading memory, replaced by the grim reality of a world that has no place for you. But what if there was another way? What if a dispute didn't end with a brehon's quiet verdict, but with the clang of steel and the roar of a crowd? Let's turn back the clock, back to a time before the verdict of banishment was even given. Let's imagine a situation where two men, perhaps rivals for a chieftain's favour, or locked in a dispute over land, simply couldn't agree. In this world there was a dramatic, often final form of conflict resolution: trial by combat. This wasn't a free-for-all brawl or a street fight. This was a highly ritualised and legally sanctioned event. Think of it less as a duel and more as a physical court case, where the gods themselves were called upon to serve as the ultimate judge. The logic was simple, if brutal. The divine would favour the righteous party. So, if you were a man who felt wronged and the brehon's judgment wasn't enough, or if the case was too tangled for a simple verdict, you could challenge your opponent to a fight, and the outcome of that fight would be the final irrefutable truth. You stand in the centre of a communal green, a circle of people gathered around you, their faces a mix of anticipation and dread. You've challenged your rival, a man you've long suspected of trying to cheat you out of your ancestral lands. He has accepted. The weapons are laid out, perhaps a sword and a shield, or maybe just a few well-chosen staves. The rules are clear. The fight is not to the death, at least not always. Sometimes, the goal is simply to incapacitate your opponent, to force a submission, but the stakes are high, because the loss isn't just about a physical beating. The loser is not only proven wrong in the eyes of the community, but also in the eyes of the gods. Their honour price, the one we talked about before, is permanently diminished. They become a lesser man. The fight begins. The clang of metal, the grunts of exertion, the gasps from the crowd, it all blurs into a chaotic, terrifying symphony. You're not just fighting for your land, you're fighting for your very reputation. You're standing in the community and for the righteousness of your claim. It's a high-stakes gamble where your physical prowess is seen as a direct reflection of your moral integrity. If you win, you're not just the victor, you're the one who was right all along. The land is yours, and your honour is restored. If you lose, not only do you lose the land, but you lose face in a way that no amount of restitution could ever fully heal. A mainstream historical fact is that trial by combat was a feature of legal systems across medieval Europe, not just in Ireland. It was a common way of settling disputes, especially for nobles and knights. But in Ireland, its use was perhaps more deeply tied to the pagan belief that the gods would intervene to ensure justice. The Christian faith would later co-opt this idea, but the underlying principle of a divine verdict remained. It was a form of justice that required the participants to put their bodies on the line, a terrifyingly direct way of proving your truth. It was a physical manifestation of the oath, a final, unarguable confirmation of who was right and who was wrong. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's some evidence that for certain disputes the combatants might have been given strange non-lethal weapons to use. For example, some records suggest that for a dispute between two women, or between a man and a woman, the men might have been given a bludgeon while the women were given a sack full of rocks. The man might even have been buried up to his waist to make the fight more fair. It sounds ridiculous to our modern ears, but it speaks to a legal system that was trying to be creative in how it applied this kind of brutal justice. It was a way of ensuring that the spectacle was both entertaining and, in their eyes, just. It was a testament to the fact that even in something as brutal as a trial by combat, there was a deeply ingrained set of rules and rituals that had to be followed. And here we come to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether trial by combat was a sign of a primitive legal system or a sophisticated way of preventing larger, more destructive blood feuds. On one hand, it seems barbaric to settle a legal dispute with a fistfight. On the other hand, in a world where families and clans were always on the verge of conflict, a ritualised fight between two individuals might have been a clever way of diffusing tensions before they escalated into all-out war. By having the dispute settled by a formal duel, the community could move on, with a clear winner and loser, without having to risk the lives of many. It was a way of containing violence, not encouraging it. and it's a fascinating perspective that challenges our modern assumptions about what constitutes a just legal system. The fight ends. You stand over your defeated rival, your chest heaving, your body aching. The crowd cheers, not just for you, but for the verdict that has been delivered. You have not just won a piece of land, you have won the moral high ground. Your honour price is intact, and your reputation is secured. The verdict of the Brean has been upheld by the very forces of the universe, or so the story goes. You look down at your defeated opponent, and you know, with a chilling certainty, that his punishment has just begun. He is now the man who was proven wrong, the man who was found wanting in the eyes of his gods. He will carry that shame far longer than his wounds will heal, and you, the victor, have not just won a case, you have won your very place in the world. It's a brutal, beautiful, and deeply unsettling form of justice. But for the ancient Irish, it was the final word. You've walked away from the trial by combat, the taste of victory or perhaps defeat, still fresh in your mouth. You've seen how justice can be delivered by the sword. But let's rewind again and step into a different kind of court, one where the judge isn't a Brean with his ancient laws, and the verdict isn't delivered with steel. This is the court of the spiritual world, a place far more terrifying and unpredictable. Because in ancient Ireland, the most feared punishment of all often came from a figure who wielded no weapon, wore no crown, and held no legal office. We're talking about the power of the Druid's curse. Imagine a crime has been committed. Let's say a chieftain has acted unjustly, taking land from a weaker family without cause, and the Brean has been unable to secure a fair restitution. The wronged family, feeling helpless against the power of the chieftain, turns to a different kind of authority. They seek out the Druid, a spiritual leader, a priest, a sorcerer, and a keeper of ancient wisdom, all rolled into one. The Druid listens to their tale, and his face is a mask of solemn fury. He agrees to act. This is where the punishment gets truly bizarre. The Druid, with his intimate knowledge of the supernatural world, doesn't just ask the gods for a bit of bad luck. He performs a ritual, a meticulously crafted act of magical warfare, designed to bring about a very specific and terrible consequence. He might chant a powerful incantation, use sacred stones, or even compose a satirical poem so cutting it was believed to have physical power. The poem, a glamdisen in Old Irish, was thought to be so potent that it could cause boils and blemishes to break out all over the chieftain's face, permanently disfiguring him and stripping him of his honour. This wasn't just a poem, it was a weapon. It was believed that the sheer magical force of the words would cause physical harm, a direct manifestation of the spiritual judgment. The chieftain now lives in terror. He doesn't fear the Brean because he has the power to ignore his ruling. But he fears the Druid's curse. He fears that his crops will fail, his cattle will sicken, and his family will be struck with misfortune. He fears that the very gods of the land, the spirits of the river and the forest, have turned against him. The Druid's curse was a non-negotiable sentence, a cosmic judgment that couldn't be bought off with cows or sidestepped with political manoeuvring. It was a spiritual guillotine, a final and terrible word from the forces that governed the world. A mainstream historical fact is that the Druids were a hugely powerful and influential class in pre-Christian Ireland. They were not just religious leaders, they were also advisors to kings, educators of the youth, and judicial authorities in their own right, sometimes even having a higher social standing than the Breans. Their power was a blend of spiritual authority and practical knowledge, and their role in society was absolutely central. When Christianity arrived, the Druids' power was diminished, but the fear of their curses and their supernatural abilities persisted in folklore for centuries. Now for a quirky tidbit, there's a fascinating tale in Irish mythology about a poet who composed a satirical poem so powerful it caused a man to die of shame. This poet, or Fili, was a direct descendant of the Druids, and his poems were not just for entertainment, they were instruments of social control. The fear of being the subject of such a poem was immense. To have your flaws and your misdeeds immortalised in a satirical verse was a fate worse than death, because it didn't just ruin your reputation. It was believed to have a physical, debilitating effect on your body. It was a form of magical warfare fought with words instead of swords, and it was a terrifyingly effective way of keeping powerful people in line. And here we come to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the power of the Druids and their curses was a genuine belief in supernatural magic or a clever form of psychological warfare. Did the chieftains truly believe that a curse would make them sick, or was the fear of being seen as a man cursed by the gods so great that they would often concede to the demands of the wronged party just to avoid the social stigma? On one hand, the evidence from the sagas and legal texts suggests a very real and deeply held belief in the supernatural power of the Druids. On the other hand, it's easy to see how a powerful class of spiritual leaders could use this belief to their advantage, wielding the fear of the unknown to enforce a kind of justice that no one else could. The truth, as always, is probably a mix of both, but it's a fascinating look into the mind of a society that saw no hard line between the physical world and the spiritual one. You can almost feel the chill wind of the curse as you stand there. The chieftain, a man who once seemed invincible, is now a shadow of his former self, his face perhaps covered in boils, his mind plagued by fear. His power has been rendered meaningless by a few words spoken by a man with no army and no kingdom. The Brean laws, with their complex rules of restitution and combat, seem almost quaint in comparison. The Druid's curse was a punishment that didn't just affect the man, it affected his very soul. It was a cosmic imbalance, a spiritual wound that couldn't be healed with fines or even with a victory in a duel. It was a final, terrible justice delivered not by the hand of man, but by the will of the gods themselves, and in this ancient world that was the most final and terrifying verdict of all. The air still hums with the residual fear of the Druid's curse, a potent reminder that in this world, justice isn't just a legal matter, it's a supernatural one. The power of words, of incantations, and of sacred rites has just been demonstrated. But what if the spiritual punishment wasn't delivered by a powerful druid, but was instead an act of personal ritualistic vengeance? Let's venture to a different kind of sacred space, one not in a great hall or a forest grove, but often by a lonely well or a stone monument. We're going to look at the ritualistic act of cursing with stones, a practice that was both a terrifying spiritual weapon and a fringe form of folk justice. Imagine a situation where a person has been grievously wronged, but for whatever reason, they cannot get a Brean to hear their case. Perhaps their opponent is too powerful, or the evidence is too weak. They feel that the legal system has failed them. Their recourse is not to give up, but to seek a different kind of retribution, one that operates outside the man-made laws. They go to a holy place, a well-known for its ancient power, or a standing stone where the ancestors are believed to reside. Here, they perform a specific ritual with what are known as cursing stones. These stones, often small, smooth river stones, would be placed on a larger flat rock, sometimes with a cross or some other symbol carved into it. The person seeking vengeance would turn the stones, often reciting a chant or a prayer, calling upon the spiritual forces of the place to bring misfortune upon their enemy. The act of turning the stones was a symbolic act of turning the luck of the other person, twisting their fate from good to ill. It was an intensely personal and deeply felt act of spiritual retribution, a final, desperate plea to the universe for justice when all other avenues had failed. The fear of these curses was very real. In a society that believed in the spiritual world as a tangible active force, the act of someone turning the cursing stones against you was not to be taken lightly. It was believed that the curse could bring all manner of misfortune, a sickness, a blight on your crops, the loss of a child, or even a sudden violent death. The curse was a form of spiritual contagion, and once it was cast, it was almost impossible to reverse. The person who had been wronged didn't just want restitution, they wanted to see their enemy suffer in a way that the laws of man could never quite achieve. A mainstream historical fact is that many of these cursing stones and cursing wells have survived to this day, and they are scattered all over Ireland. Some of them are located in ancient monastic sites, a testament to how these pagan practices were often absorbed and repurposed by the early Christian church. The Christian priests might have tried to reframe them as places of healing or prayer, but the old dark reputation of the stones as a place of vengeance persisted in the local folklore. It's a fascinating example of how a deeply ingrained spiritual practice could survive for centuries, even in the face of a new and powerful religion. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a specific kind of cursing stone known as a coff.ee, or a stone for restraining. These were often found near ancient burial sites or monastic ruins. The tradition was that if you believed someone had wronged you, You could go to the stone and turn it, asking for the curse to be put on them. But here's the kicker. The curse was only supposed to work if your cause was just. If you were in the wrong, the curse would turn back on you, bringing the very misfortune you wished on your enemy down upon yourself. It was a bizarre kind of spiritual justice system, a high-stakes gamble where you had to be absolutely certain of your own righteousness before you dared to play. It was a check on a person's motives, a spiritual lie detector test in a world that had no other way of proving someone's truth. And here we come to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the use of cursing stones was a tool of the desperate or a form of social control used by a lower class against the powerful. Was it a last resort for a poor person who couldn't get a chieftain to listen to their plight? Or was it a more general practice, a way for everyone to air their grievances and seek a form of justice when the more formal legal systems failed them? It's a question that goes to the heart of class and power in ancient Ireland. The Brehon laws were often tied to the nobility and the wealthy, but the cursing stones were available to everyone. It was a kind of folk justice that existed in parallel to the formal system, a quiet, terrifying way for the common people to get their revenge. You can almost feel the chilling air of the place, the silent power of the stones, as you imagine the wrong person turning them, their mind filled with a righteous fury. The cursing stones weren't just a punishment. They were a form of spiritual vengeance, a way of evening the score when the odds were stacked against you. It was a system of justice that required no witness, no brehon, and no payment of fines. It was a pure, unadulterated act of spiritual retribution. And in a world where the spirits were always watching, where the land itself was an active participant in your life, the fear of these stones was a more potent deterrent than any law could ever be. You trudge on, feeling the weight of the invisible forces that govern this world, and you realise that in this place, a simple rock can be more dangerous than a sword. We've journeyed through the terrifying power of the Druid's curse and the grim ritual of cursing stones. You've seen how the spiritual and the legal worlds were deeply intertwined, and how a person could be punished by forces far beyond the reach of a chieftain or a brehon. But what if the punishment was both a legal and a spiritual act? What if you could be declared dead without ever actually dying? Let's delve into one of the most bizarre and psychologically devastating punishments of ancient Ireland. The ritual of symbolic death, a practice known as the Fane ritual. Imagine a scenario where a person has committed a crime so vile that they have lost all their standing, all their honour, and all their legal rights. It's not just a theft or a broken oath. It's an act of deep betrayal against their own kin or against the community itself. Banishment isn't seen as enough. The community needs to make a statement, to ritually cleanse itself of this person's existence without resorting to a messy, violent execution that could spark a blood feud. The brehon, in this case, delivers a verdict that is both a legal pronouncement and a mystical declaration. The person is to be declared socially dead. The Fane ritual would likely be a sombre, terrifying spectacle. The person who is to be punished is often stripped of their clothes, their hair might be shorn, and their face covered. They are then led to the edge of the community, to a place that is neither inside nor outside, a liminal space. A brehon or a druid would then perform a ritual, a series of chants and symbolic acts that would strip the person of their name, their lineage, and their legal identity. It was a kind of anti-baptism, a ritual of unmaking. The person was, for all intents and purposes, ritually buried alive. The community would then go through the motions of mourning them as if they had died a physical death. After the ritual, the person was cast out, but their status was far worse than a simple banishment. A banished person was a man without a tribe. A person who had undergone the Fane ritual was a man who no longer existed. They had no legal recourse, no family to turn to, and no name to call their own. Their previous life was over. They were no longer considered a person in the eyes of the law, and their existence was treated as a kind of waking ghosthood. They were a reminder to the community of the terrible consequences of total betrayal, a living monument to the power of the social contract. And the punishment was ongoing. They would have to live with the knowledge that they had been erased, that their family was mourning them, and that they had no place to go. A mainstream historical fact is that the Brehon laws had a very clear legal distinction between different categories of people, from the free farmer, Fithla, to the landless tenant, Fuidir. The Fane ritual was a way of creating a category of person that was even lower than the lowest tenant, a person who was, for legal purposes, a non-entity. This legal fiction of social death was a powerful tool for a society that was so deeply rooted in kinship and legal status. It was a way of permanently severing a person from the web of obligations and protections that defined their life, without having to take on the moral or social burden of a physical execution. Now, for a quirky tidbit, there's some evidence that after the ritual of symbolic death, the person's family would have to perform a strange kind of funeral. They wouldn't just mourn, they might have to ritually bury a symbolic effigy of the person, a kind of doll or a piece of cloth representing their dead relative. This was a way of reinforcing the idea that the person was truly gone, a way of making the legal fiction a social reality. It was a heartbreaking act for the family, but it was also a way for them to signal to the community that they had complied with the Brehon's verdict and that they too had cut off all ties to the disgraced individual. The entire community was a participant in the punishment, from the Brehon who made the verdict to the family who had to perform the ritualistic burial. And here we come to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the true nature of the Fane ritual. Was it a punishment used for only the most heinous of crimes, or was it a more common verdict for those who simply couldn't pay their debts and had no kin to support them? Some scholars argue that it was a last resort, a devastating punishment reserved for the worst of the worst. Others contend that it was a more practical legal tool, a way for a community to deal with individuals who were a burden or a threat without having to feed them or imprison them. It's a debate that touches on the very nature of justice in ancient Ireland, and whether it was truly about moral retribution or about practical social control. You stand at the edge of the community watching the forlorn figure trudge away, their new non-existence a heavy cloak around their shoulders. They have no name, no past, and no future. They are a ghost in the waking world, a shadow of the person they once were. The punishment isn't just about the physical hardship of exile, it's about the deep psychological horror of being erased. You remember the concept of the honour price we talked about before, and you realise that a person who has undergone the Fane ritual has an honour price of 0. They are quite literally worth nothing. It's a punishment so final, so complete, that it makes banishment seem almost merciful. It's a reminder that in this world, your identity is not your own. It belongs to the community, and the community can take it away. You've witnessed the chilling finality of the Fane ritual, a punishment that erases a person without a drop of blood being spilled. You're beginning to see that in this world the greatest threats aren't always a sword or a debt. They can be the subtle, terrifying forces of the supernatural. This leads us to a fascinating aspect of ancient Irish justice, one that operates not through the Brehon laws or the power of a druid, but through a deeply ingrained belief in cosmic balance. We're going to explore the concept of unlucky acts and the very real fear of supernatural retribution. Imagine the world you're in now. The line between the physical and the spiritual is blurry, if it exists at all. The land isn't just dirt and rock, it's a living entity, filled with spirits, ancestors, and ancient powers. Every act you perform, no matter how small, has a ripple effect on this spiritual ecosystem. And some acts, some deeply taboo things, were believed to be so disruptive to this balance that they would bring about a kind of cosmic punishment, not just on the offender, but on the entire community. These were the unlucky acts. One of the most famous examples of an unlucky act was the killing of a sacred animal. In some regions, certain animals, like a king's boar or a sacred white cow, were seen as having a spiritual significance. To kill one of these animals was not just a crime against the king or the owner, it was a crime against the gods themselves. It was an act of profound disrespect to the very forces that governed the land, and the punishment was believed to be a curse on the entire region. The crops might fail, the cattle might sicken, and the rains might stop. The man who committed the act wasn't just a criminal. He was a bringer of famine, a destroyer of the community. The community, in turn, would often cast him out or even kill him, not out of a sense of revenge, but out of a desperate need to cleanse the land of his ill fortune. His punishment wasn't a verdict from a Brehon. It was an act of self-preservation from a terrified populace. You trudge through a field, the crops looking sickly and brown. You hear the whispers. It was him. He killed the white sow. The anger in the whispers isn't just about the loss of a valuable animal. It's about a deep, primal fear that this man's single act of hubris has put the lives of everyone at risk. His punishment is a kind of collective self-defense, a desperate attempt to restore the balance that he has so carelessly upset. There's no Brayan here, no trial by combat. There's just a terrified community and a man who has broken an unspoken but deeply understood law of the cosmos. A mainstream historical fact is that this belief in the interconnectedness of a king's fortune and the land's prosperity was a common theme in Irish mythology. A good king was one whose rule brought peace, prosperity and fertile land. A bad king was one whose misdeeds brought famine, disease and war. This wasn't just a poetic metaphor, it was a deeply held belief. The king's honour and the land's health were seen as two sides of the same coin. This belief gave the people a very real way of holding their leaders accountable. If the crops failed, it wasn't just bad luck. It was a sign that the king had committed an unlucky act, and that his rule was no longer just. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a fascinating provision in some of the Brehon laws that deals with a very specific kind of unlucky act. It was considered deeply unlucky to steal a salmon from a sacred river or a holy well. This salmon, a symbol of wisdom and knowledge in Irish mythology, was seen as a spiritual entity. To steal one was to not just steal food, it was to steal wisdom, to steal from the gods. The punishment for this was often not a fine, but a supernatural retribution that might result in the man going mad or his family being struck with illness. The salmon wasn't just a fish. It was a part of the spiritual fabric of the land, and to take it was to tear that fabric. And here we come to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the fear of these unlucky acts was a genuine religious belief or a clever tool of social control. On one hand, the evidence from the myths and folklore suggests a very real and deeply held spiritual belief. On the other hand, it's easy to see how a chieftain could use this belief to enforce taboos that were beneficial to his own power. For example, by declaring that a certain animal was sacred, he could ensure that no one would dare to poach his best livestock. Was the fear of supernatural retribution a genuine belief, or was it a form of public relations, a way of using religion to enforce a kind of secular law? The truth, as always, is a murky mix, but it's a fascinating question that reveals a lot about the way power and religion were used in ancient Ireland. You look at the man, the accused, being pushed out of the community by a terrified mob. His punishment isn't the Brehon's verdict. It's the silent, collective terror of a people who believe that he has just brought a curse upon them all. He's not just being punished for a crime, he's being punished for a cosmic imbalance. He is a man who has broken a law that was never written down, a man who has dared to offend the very spirits of the land. His punishment is a testament to the fact that in this world, your actions have consequences that go far beyond the sight of men. They affect the very health of the earth beneath your feet. And that in itself is a terrifying and final verdict. The air is thick with the weight of unspoken curses and the fear of supernatural retribution. You've just witnessed a community act as judge, jury and executioner, all out of a desperate need to cleanse itself of a man who broke a cosmic law. But what about a punishment that is far more subtle, yet no less devastating? What about a punishment that doesn't rely on curses or mobs, but on the simple, crushing power of social exclusion? We're going to explore the punishment of excommunication from the feast. Imagine the heart of a community in ancient Ireland. It's not a town square or a temple, it's the great hall of the chieftain, a place of warmth, light and fellowship. This is where the community gathers, where stories are told, where alliances are forged, and where disputes are often settled over food and drink. The communal feast, or fled, wasn't just a party, it was the very fabric of social life. Your place at the table, your rank at the feast, was a direct reflection of your standing in society. To be invited was a sign of respect and honour. To be excluded was a fate almost as bad as banishment. You've committed a crime, perhaps a minor one, but one that has nonetheless caused a stir in the community. You've paid the honour price, you've apologised, and you've done what you can to make amends. But the Brayan, or perhaps the chieftain himself, decides that a final, powerful lesson needs to be taught. The verdict is delivered not with a shout or a decree, but with a quiet, chilling sentence. You're no longer welcome at the chieftain's table. You're excommunicated from the feast. This isn't a simple social snub. This is a public, deliberate act of ostracism. You stand on the periphery, watching as the people you've known your entire life enter the great hall. You can hear the low hum of conversation, the laughter, the music, and the clinking of cups. You smell the roasted meat and the warm bread. But you can't go in. You are a ghost standing outside a place that was once your home, watching a life that you were once a part of. The punishment isn't just about the loss of food or drink, it's about the loss of fellowship. It's about being invisible in a society where being seen is everything. It's about being cut off from the very heart of the community. You're no longer a person of honour, a member of the Tuath. You are a person who stands outside, a man who is not welcome at the table. This punishment, which might seem gentle to us, was a form of social warfare. It signalled to everyone that you were no longer to be trusted, that you were not to be given a place of honour, and that you were, for all intents and purposes, a pariah. The effects of this excommunication would ripple out into every part of your life. Your honour price would diminish. People would be less likely to trade with you, to help you in a time of need, or to stand with you in a dispute. The punishment wasn't physical, but its effects were devastatingly real. A mainstream historical fact is that the great feasts of the chieftains were meticulously organised events, with a strict seating plan that was based on the social status of each person. The more important you were, the closer you sat to the chieftain. This wasn't just a matter of etiquette, it was a matter of law. The Bressan laws had specific provisions for the order of seating at a feast, and a violation of this could be a cause for a legal dispute. This shows just how seriously these gatherings were taken, and why exclusion from them was such a potent form of punishment. The feast was a legal and social spectacle, a physical representation of the entire social order. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a fascinating tradition known as the Feinschliaban, or the self-cradle. This was a kind of portable bed or basket that a banished person might have had to carry with them, often made of wicker and large enough to be a public humiliating burden. The purpose of this was twofold. First, it was a visible sign of their outcast status, a kind of mobile shame. But second, it was also a place for them to sleep, a final act of begrudging hospitality from the community, a way of saying, "You're no longer one of us, but we will not let you die in a ditch." It was a strange blend of brutal punishment and a faint residual sense of communal responsibility, a final, sad acknowledgement of the person who was once one of their own. And here we come to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether excommunication from the feast was a punishment in itself, or a symptom of a deeper, more profound form of ostracism. Was the chieftain's decision to exclude someone from the feast the cause of their loss of status? Or was it the public recognition of a loss of status that had already occurred? Some scholars argue that the act of exclusion was a formal punishment, a legal sentence delivered by the chieftain. Others contend that it was a more organic social process, a way for the community to show, as a collective, that they no longer considered the person to be one of their own. It's a debate that gets to the heart of how social order was maintained in a world without police or prisons, and whether the power came from the top down or from the bottom up. You turn away from the light of the great hall, the laughter a distant, painful echo in your ears. You walk into the darkness, a solitary figure. The punishment isn't the cold or the hunger, it's the knowledge that you are alone, that you've been erased from the communal memory. The feast, a symbol of life and community, is now a symbol of your absence. You're a man who has lost his place, and in this world, that is the most final and terrifying punishment of all. You're a ghost, wandering in the land of the living, forever exiled from the warmth of the fire and the fellowship of the feast. The echo of laughter from the great hall fades into the night, leaving you with the chilling reality of social exile. You've seen how the punishment of being a pariah is not a quick, sharp pain, but a slow, grinding dissolution of your very being. Now, let's pivot to a different kind of punishment, one that operates on the same principle of social isolation and supernatural fear, but focuses on a resource that was, in many ways, more valuable than gold: water. We're going to explore the law of the well, a form of punishment where a person's source of water was ritually cursed or polluted. Imagine the landscape of ancient Ireland once again. It's a world of rolling green hills, but it's not a land of easy living. Droughts are a real and constant fear. Water, especially clean water, is a source of life, health, and spiritual purity. A well isn't just a hole in the ground. It's a sacred place, a place of nourishment and ancient power. To pollute or curse a well was not just a crime against a person, it was a crime against the land, a deeply taboo act that could bring misfortune on an entire community. The law of the well was a punishment that operated on this very principle. Let's say a man has committed a crime, perhaps a repeated act of thievery, and the Brehon has decided that a simple fine isn't enough. The community needs a stronger, more lasting deterrent. The Brehon delivers his verdict. The man's well is to be ritually cursed. This isn't just a matter of someone throwing some dirt in it. This is a formal, ritualistic act, often performed by a Brehon or a druid, that declared the well to be impure, poisoned and taboo. A symbol, perhaps a crooked branch or a painted stone, might be placed near the well to warn others. The water might still look clean, but in the minds of the community, it was now tainted, both physically and spiritually. The punishment of the well was particularly insidious because it didn't just affect the man, it affected his entire family. His wife and children were now forced to walk miles to the nearest spring for water, a daily reminder of the father's crime. Their neighbours, out of a fear of spiritual contagion, would likely refuse to share their own water. The man was now not just a thief, he was a polluter, a man who had brought a curse down on his own household. The punishment wasn't about a locked cell. It was about the endless, grinding hardship of living a life without the most basic necessity. It was a punishment that wasn't just physical, but psychological and spiritual as well. A mainstream historical fact is that wells and springs were often seen as sacred sites in both pagan and early Christian Ireland. Many of them were dedicated to a specific saint or deity, and the act of polluting them was seen as a grave offence. The Brehon laws had specific provisions for dealing with the pollution of water sources, often with very heavy fines. This shows just how seriously the ancient Irish took the concept of clean water and its spiritual significance. The law of the well was a brutal but logical extension of this belief, a way of punishing a person by taking away their most sacred and necessary resource. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a fascinating tradition known as the fairy well, or clooty well, which was a well where people would go to leave offerings, often in the form of rags or cloots, to the spirits of the well. The rags were often left to ask for a healing or a blessing. The flip side of this was the belief that if you disrespected a fairy well, the spirits would bring a curse upon you. This was a form of spiritual justice, a punishment delivered not by a man, but by the very spirits of the land. The law of the well was a way of tapping into this ancient fear, a way of weaponizing the spiritual belief in the power of sacred water for the purpose of punishment. And here we come to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue about whether the pollution of the well was a symbolic act or a physical one. Was the Brehon's verdict to curse the well a purely ritualistic pronouncement, or was there often an act of physical pollution as well, a way of making the curse a reality? Some scholars argue that the curse was a purely spiritual act, a way of making the community believe the water was tainted. Others contend that the Brehons were also quite practical, and that they might have ordered a physical pollutant to be placed in the well to make the punishment a reality. It's a debate that gets to the heart of how magic and law intertwined in ancient Ireland, and whether the punishments were truly about the spirit or about the cold, hard reality of daily life. You stand by the cursed well, a silent monument to your crime. The water looks so clear, so inviting, but the fear in your heart and the whispers of the community tell you it's a poisoned chalice. The punishment isn't the physical act of fetching water from a distant spring, it's the constant nagging fear that your family is being punished for your sins. The law of the well was a brilliant and brutal punishment because it made your crime a burden on the people you loved most. It was a punishment that was both social and physical, a final and terrifying reminder that in this world your actions have consequences that go far beyond yourself, and can even taint the very water you drink. You turn away from the well, the long walk to the spring a daily silent penance. You've just felt the sting of a cursed well, a punishment that turns the very source of life into a symbol of your disgrace. The weight of social and spiritual ostracism is a heavy cloak on your shoulders. Now, let's explore a different kind of punishment, one that is not invisible or ritualistic, but instead is a permanent physical mark on your body. We're going to look at the use of bodily marks and physical disfigurement as a form of punishment, a way of turning the human body into a walking, living testament to a crime. Imagine a crime has been committed, perhaps a theft, a lie, or an act of betrayal. The Brehon delivers his verdict. The punishment isn't a fine or a period of exile. It's something far more personal and permanent. You are to be branded. A hot iron, shaped into a specific symbol, is pressed into your skin. The pain is searing, but the real punishment comes after, when the wound has healed and left a permanent visible mark. This mark, this scar, is now a part of you. It's a sign that you are a criminal, a liar, a man who cannot be trusted. It's a scarlet letter, but one made of flesh and bone. The brand isn't just about the physical pain. It's about the public shaming that comes with it. You can't hide it. You can't wash it off. Every time you try to trade for grain, every time you try to join a conversation, every time you try to get a job, people will see the mark. They will know what you are. They will know what you did. It's a punishment that follows you for the rest of your life, a constant reminder of your shame. And in a society where so much of your identity was tied to your honour and your reputation, a physical mark of disgrace was a fate far worse than a temporary fine or a short period of exile. In some cases, the punishment wasn't just a brand. It could be a physical disfigurement. A man who was a repeated liar might have had his tongue ritually cut, a permanent sign of his inability to be truthful. A man who was a thief might have had a finger severed, a permanent mark of his crime. These punishments were not just about retribution. They were about making the punishment a part of the person themselves. They were about ensuring that the crime was never forgotten, and that the person who committed it would be a living, breathing testament to the law. A mainstream historical fact is that this kind of physical punishment, known as branding or maiming, was a common form of punishment across many ancient and medieval societies, not just in Ireland. It was a brutal but highly effective way of marking a criminal and making them an outcast. In some societies, the specific body part that was marked was directly related to the crime. For example, a thief might have a hand branded, a perjurer might have a mark on their tongue, and a deserter might have a brand on their forehead. It was a system that was both gruesome and logical, a way of making the punishment fit the crime in a very literal way. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a fascinating provision in some of the Brehon laws that deals with the physical disfigurement of a person. It was a serious crime to disfigure a person, and the fine for it could be very high. But here's the interesting part. If the disfigurement was done in a fight or a trial by combat, the fine might not be as high, because the disfigurement was seen as a part of a legal process. This shows a very sophisticated way of thinking about violence and its consequences. A random act of violence was a crime, but a violence that was a part of a legal process was a different matter entirely. It was a way of distinguishing between a crime and a legally sanctioned act of justice, a distinction that many modern legal systems still struggle with. And here we come to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the use of physical punishments like branding and maiming was a sign of a brutal society or a practical one. On one hand, the punishments seem incredibly cruel, a form of public torture that would be unthinkable in our modern world. On the other hand, in a world without prisons, without police, and without a centralised bureaucracy, these punishments might have been seen as a necessary evil. They were a way of punishing a person without having to feed them or house them, a way of making sure that their crime was never forgotten, and a way of making them an example to the rest of the community. It's a debate that gets to the heart of what justice meant in this ancient world, and whether it was about rehabilitation or about retribution. You run your hand over the scar, a raised, angry patch of skin on your arm. The pain is long gone, but the shame of it is a constant nagging ache. You're no longer just a man, you're a branded man. You're a man with a past that is literally etched into your flesh. The punishment wasn't a fine or a banishment. It was a part of your body. It was a part of your identity. You walk through the village, your head down, trying to hide the mark, but you know that everyone sees it. They know what it means, and in a way the punishment has succeeded. You are a living example of the law, a human billboard of your own shame, and you know, with a chilling certainty, that the punishment of the brand is one that will never, ever end. You've just felt the sting of a permanent brand, a physical mark that announces your crime to the world. You've seen how justice can be delivered by the community, by the supernatural, and by the Brehon. But what happens when the legal system is at its most powerful, when the verdict comes not from a scholar of the law but from the man at the very top? We're going to explore the ultimate legal authority in ancient Ireland, the king's judgment and his power. Imagine yourself now not in a Brehon's quiet study, but in the great hall of a king, a man who, though not an absolute ruler in the modern sense, wielded immense power. The king was more than a political leader. He was the living embodiment of the tuath, the tribe. His fortune and the land's prosperity were believed to be intertwined. His word carried a weight that no one else's could, and while he was often advised by brehons, his final judgment was sometimes the final word. A crime has been committed, a dispute so grave that it has shaken the very foundation of the community. Perhaps it's a conflict between two powerful families, one that threatens to erupt into a blood feud. The brehon has delivered his verdict, but the losing party refuses to accept it. The only one left to intervene is the king. He sits on his throne, his face a mask of solemn authority. He listens to the arguments, he consults with his wise men, and then he delivers his judgment. This isn't a matter of fines or honour prices anymore. This is a matter of state. The king's judgment could be anything from a simple reaffirmation of the brehon's verdict to a completely new and more severe punishment. He could banish a powerful noble who was causing trouble, even if the brehon's laws didn't call for it. He could order a public execution, a rare but not unheard of punishment for the most egregious crimes against the kingdom itself, like treason or regicide. The king was a kind of living legal safety valve, a final arbiter who could step in when the traditional legal system was at risk of failing. His power wasn't just in his ability to rule, it was in his ability to enforce a final, unarguable justice. You stand in the great hall a silent witness to the king's verdict. His words are not just a legal pronouncement, they are a command from the very heart of the kingdom. The losing party, even if they are a powerful noble, must now submit. To defy the king's judgment is not just a legal violation, it is a crime against the very fabric of society, a crime that could lead to a full-scale war. The king's authority, backed by his army and his political power, was a final check on a legal system that was otherwise based on social pressure and a fear of supernatural retribution. A mainstream historical fact is that the king's role in justice was often a balance between his personal authority and the brehon laws. He was expected to uphold the law, but he also had the power to commute sentences, pardon criminals, and act as a final court of appeal. This dual role made the king a central figure in the legal landscape of ancient Ireland. He wasn't a dictator, but his power was a real and constant force, a final word in a world of complex and sometimes ambiguous laws. His judgment was a testament to the fact that while the laws were ancient, the power to enforce them was very much in the hands of the living. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a fascinating tradition in Irish mythology known as the Crooked Judgment. It was believed that a king who delivered a false or unjust judgment would be physically disfigured. His face might break out in a terrible rash, his teeth might fall out, or his eyes might go crooked. This wasn't just a myth, it was a powerful tool of social control. The fear of a crooked judgment was a way of holding a king accountable to the law, a way of ensuring that even the most powerful man in the land had to respect the justice of the brehons. It was a bizarre kind of checks and balances, a supernatural constitutional law that ensured that the king's power was not absolute. And here we come to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the true extent of the king's legal power. Was he a living judge who had the final say in every legal matter? Or was he more of a figurehead, a person who was expected to simply enforce the laws that were handed down by the brehons? Some scholars argue that the king's power was a real and constant force, a kind of pre-modern executive authority. Others contend that his power was more symbolic, a way of giving the brehons' verdicts the force of law. It's a debate that gets to the heart of what power and authority meant in this ancient world, and whether it was a top-down or a bottom-up system. You leave the great hall, the weight of the king's judgment still hanging in the air. The dispute is settled, the feuding families have been forced to a truce, and the peace of the kingdom has been restored. The punishment, whether it was a fine, a banishment, or even a death sentence, was not just a legal act, it was an act of political will. The king's power was a final, undeniable force in a world of complex and often ambiguous laws. It was a reminder that while the brehons might have known the law, the king had the power to enforce it. And in this world, that was the most final and terrifying power of all. You've just witnessed the terrifying finality of a king's judgment, a force that could cut through a legal dispute and bring peace to a feuding kingdom. You're starting to see how every social bond, every relationship, was a potential source of both support and punishment. This leads us to a bond that was, in many ways, more important than family, the bond of fosterage. We're going to look at the foster penalty, a bizarre and brutal punishment that turned this sacred bond into a tool of justice. Imagine a world where it was common, even expected, for noble families to send their children to be raised by another family. This wasn't just a childcare arrangement, It was a deep and meaningful social contract. The foster parents would educate the child, and the bond they formed was often considered to be as strong, or even stronger, than the bond between a parent and their own child. This was the bond of fosterage, and it was a bedrock of ancient Irish society, a way of creating alliances and cementing loyalties. Now, imagine a crime has been committed, a serious one, perhaps a theft or a physical assault. The offender has no wealth to pay the honour price, no land to give as restitution, and no powerful family to support him. The Brehon delivers his verdict, and it is a truly strange one. The man is not to be fined, not to be banished, and not to be branded. Instead, he must pay a foster penalty, a payment to his foster parents. This wasn't a fine for a crime against them, but a fine for a crime against the community, a way of punishing the man by taking from the people he was closest to. This punishment was a brilliant piece of social engineering. It used the most sacred bond in society against the offender. The man's crime was now not just a crime against the community, it was a crime that had a direct and immediate impact on the very people who had raised him. His foster parents, who had once been his protectors, were now his victims. The shame of this was far greater than any fine or any public shaming. The man had not just let down his community, he had let down the people who had loved and raised him, and the price he had to pay was a fine that came from his own hide. You stand in a quiet courtyard, watching as the disgraced man has to make a payment to his aging foster parents, his head bowed in shame. Their faces are a mix of sadness and anger. They're not just taking a payment, they're taking a payment for the shame that their foster child has brought upon them. The punishment isn't just about the money, it's about the crushing emotional weight of knowing that your actions have hurt the people who had given you a life. The bond of fosterage, which was once a source of strength, is now a source of deep, abiding pain. A mainstream historical fact is that the bond of fosterage was a legal and social institution that was meticulously codified in the Brehon laws. The laws had specific provisions for the rights and duties of both the foster parents and the foster child, including the duration of the fosterage, the kind of education that was to be provided, and the specific fines that had to be paid if the contract was broken. This shows just how seriously this institution was taken, and why a punishment that involved it would have been so potent. It was a punishment that struck at the very heart of the social order, and it was a testament to the power of these deep social bonds. Now for a quirky tidbit, there's a fascinating provision in some of the Brehon laws that deals with the care of a foster child. The laws stipulated that a foster child was to be educated in a way that was appropriate to their social station. A noble child would be taught things like riding and sword play, while a commoner's child would be taught things like farming and animal husbandry. This wasn't just a matter of practicality, it was a way of reinforcing the social hierarchy. But here's the interesting part. If the foster parents failed to educate the child properly, they could be sued for a fine, a kind of ancient lawsuit for educational malpractice. It was a bizarre and specific law that shows just how much thought went into every part of this social contract. And here we come to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue about whether the foster penalty was a sign of a truly brutal legal system or a clever way of punishing a person without resorting to more violent means. On one hand, the punishment seems incredibly cruel, a way of using a person's deepest emotional bonds against them. On the other hand, in a world without prisons, it was a way of punishing a person without having to kill them or banish them. It was a way of making them feel the weight of their crime without having to resort to physical violence. It's a debate that gets to the heart of what justice meant in this ancient world, and whether it was about a cold, hard retribution or about a complex and brutal form of social control. You leave the courtyard, the image of the man and his foster parents a sad, permanent mark in your mind. The punishment wasn't a fine to the king or a public branding. It was a payment made to the people who had loved him, a payment for the shame he had brought upon them. The foster penalty was a brilliant and brutal punishment because it struck at the very core of what it meant to be a person in this world. It was a punishment that wasn't just about money. It was about the crushing emotional weight of letting down the people who had loved you most. It was a final, terrible reminder that in this world your actions have consequences that go far beyond yourself. You've just left the foster parents' courtyard, the emotional weight of that brutal punishment still heavy in the air. You're beginning to understand that in this world some laws were not just about human behaviour, they were about the very order of the cosmos. This leads us to a fascinating and deeply personal form of punishment, one that was not delivered by a brehon or a king, but by fate itself. We're going to delve into the concept of a geas, a personal taboo, and the dire supernatural consequences of breaking it. Imagine a person, perhaps a king, a warrior, or even a poet. From the moment they are born, or perhaps after a great deed, they are bound by a geas, pronounced gesh. A geas is not just a command or a rule, it's a sacred prohibition, a personal taboo that is specific to that individual. It might be something like, never eat the flesh of a dog, or never let the sun set while you're still at sea, or never refuse a woman who asks you for a favour. To break a gaze was not a legal crime. It was a cosmic one, an act of such profound spiritual disrespect that it was believed to bring about a terrible and often fatal misfortune. The geas was a kind of spiritual sword of Damocles, a constant nagging threat that hung over a person's head. A man might live his entire life meticulously following his geas, only to have a moment of carelessness or a cruel twist of fate force him to break it. The consequences weren't a fine or a banishment. The consequences were supernatural. The man might lose a battle he was destined to win. He might be struck by a sudden illness, or his very life might be forfeited to the gods. The geas was a law of the universe, and to break it was to challenge the very forces that governed reality. You stand on a windswept hill watching a famous warrior, a man known for his strength and courage, trudge toward a river. He is tired, and a woman who looks like a beggar has asked him to eat a piece of dog meat, a terrible insult and a terrible sin. His geas is, never refuse a woman who asks for a favour, but another of his geas is, never eat the flesh of a dog. He is caught between two terrible choices. He knows that if he breaks either one, his luck will run out, his strength will fail, his life will be forfeit. He has to choose his own destruction. The punishment isn't the verdict of a brehon. It's the cold, hard logic of a divine law that has no mercy. The geas was a beautiful and terrible thing, a way of giving a person a sacred power, but at the cost of a constant, nagging vulnerability. A mainstream historical fact is that the concept of a geas is a recurring and central motif in Irish mythology, most famously in the tale of Cuchulainn, a warrior who was bound by a geas and whose fate was sealed when he was forced to break it. The myths are filled with stories of heroes and kings who were brought low by a single, careless act that violated their geas. This shows that the concept was a deeply ingrained part of the ancient Irish worldview, a way of explaining why good people sometimes met with a terrible end. The geas was a kind of spiritual fate, a way of understanding the cruel and arbitrary nature of life. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a fascinating provision in some of the sagas that deals with the idea of a gaze of the salmon. The salmon, as we've seen, was a sacred animal. In some tales, a person might be given a gaze that they could never eat a salmon, even if they were starving. This was a kind of spiritual test, a way of proving their respect for the gods and the land. But here's the kicker. The geas could also be used to grant a kind of supernatural power. A person who was bound by a geas of the salmon might be granted a special insight or a magical ability. The geas wasn't just a punishment. It was a kind of magical contract, a way of giving a person a special power at the cost of a terrible vulnerability. And here we come to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue about whether the geas was a real and deeply held spiritual belief or a literary device used by the bards to tell a good story. On one hand, the ubiquity of the geas in Irish mythology suggests a very real and deeply held belief. On the other hand, the often absurd nature of the geas, a warrior who can't eat dog meat, suggests that it might have been a tool used to create drama and tension in a tale. Was the geas a real and feared part of ancient Irish life? Or was it a beautiful and terrible poetic invention? The truth, as always, is a murky mix, but it's a question that gets to the heart of what the ancient Irish believed and what they feared most. You watch the warrior, his face a mask of sorrow and resignation, as he makes his choice. He breaks his geas, and you can almost feel the spiritual fabric of the world tearing around him. The punishment isn't a fine, a banishment, or a physical brand. It's the slow, terrible dissolution of his luck, his health, and his life. The geas was a beautiful and terrible punishment, because it was a punishment that came from within. It was a punishment that you carried with you your entire life, a constant nagging reminder that your fate was not your own. And in this world, that was the most final and terrifying punishment of all. You've just witnessed the self-inflicted doom of a man caught between two terrible taboos. The weight of his gaze, a personal and cosmic law, has brought about his ruin. Now let's turn to a different kind of punishment, one that was not for a common criminal, but for the very person who was supposed to be the arbiter of justice. We're going to look at the punishment for a Brehon who delivered a deliberately false or unjust ruling. This was a system of justice with a built-in check and balance, a way of ensuring that even the judge had to fear the law. Imagine a Brehon, a man of immense legal knowledge and high social standing. He's the keeper of the ancient laws, the voice of justice in the community. He is revered, respected, and his word is almost always final. But what if he is corrupt? What if he takes a bribe from a powerful chieftain to deliver a verdict that he knows is wrong? What if he twists the law to favour a friend and punish an enemy? In a world without a court of appeals, without a system of checks and balances, this would be a catastrophic failure of the justice system. The ancient Irish knew this, and they had a truly bizarre but brilliant way of dealing with it. The punishment for a Brehon who delivered a crooked judgment was not a fine or a banishment. It was believed that the act of delivering a false verdict would cause a physical, visible disfigurement on the Brehon's face. His mouth might twist to the side, his nose might go crooked, or a terrible rash might break out on his skin. This wasn't just a physical ailment, it was a spiritual and social one. A Brehon's face was a symbol of his integrity. A straight mouth, a clear eye, a calm demeanour. These were the physical signs of a man who was wise and just. A crooked face was a sign of a crooked judgment, a physical manifestation of his moral failing. The shame of this was far greater than any fine. A Brehon who was physically disfigured by his own unjust judgment was no longer a Brehon. His authority was gone. His reputation was ruined. He was a living, breathing testament to his own corruption, a man who had been punished not by the king or the community, but by the very forces of justice themselves. He was a pariah, a man who could no longer be trusted, and his career as a judge was over. The punishment wasn't about a locked cell. It was about the crushing weight of public shame and the loss of the one thing that defined his life, his integrity. A mainstream historical fact is that this belief in the physical consequences of a false judgment was a recurring theme in Irish mythology and lore. There are tales of kings and judges who were physically disfigured by their own unjust rulings. This belief was not just a superstition, it was a powerful tool of social control. The Brehons, who were often the most powerful and influential people in the community, had a very real and very visceral reason to be honest and just. The fear of a crooked face was a final check on their power, a way of ensuring that even the most powerful had to respect the law. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a fascinating tradition in the Brehon laws that deals with the idea of a false testimony. If a person gave a false testimony in a court case, the Brehon could order them to perform a strange kind of penance. They might have to stand in the centre of the community assembly and confess their lie. But here's the kicker. They might also have to eat a symbolic meal, often a mixture of dirt and dung to represent the filth of their lie. It was a brutal and humiliating punishment, a way of making the person not just say they were sorry, but to physically and metaphorically ingest their own wrongdoing. It was a bizarre and specific law that shows just how much thought went into every part of this system of justice. And here we come to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue about whether the punishment of a crooked judgment was a genuine belief in supernatural retribution or a clever way of using social pressure to enforce honesty. On one hand, the ubiquity of the myth suggests a very real and deeply held belief. On the other hand, it's easy to see how a community could use this belief to enforce honesty. A Brehon who was suspected of taking a bribe would be shunned by the community, and his physical appearance might be interpreted as a sign of his corruption. It's a debate that gets to the heart of what justice meant in this ancient world, and whether it was about a supernatural consequence or a social one. You look at the Brehon, his face a mask of shame and physical disfigurement, a living monument to his own unjust ruling. The punishment isn't a fine, a banishment, or a death sentence. It's the slow, terrible dissolution of his reputation, his power, and his integrity. The punishment of a crooked judgment was a brilliant and brutal punishment because it struck at the very core of what it meant to be a Brehon. It was a punishment that you carried with you your entire life, a constant nagging reminder that your integrity was not your own. And in this world, That was the most final and terrifying punishment of all. You've just witnessed the self-inflicted ruin of a corrupt Brehon, his face a testament to a broken legal system. The punishment for his crime came not from a king's decree, but from a spiritual conviction, a cosmic balance that righted itself. Now let's pivot from the living to the long dead. We're going to explore a theory so grim and fascinating, so tied to the land itself, that it bridges the gap between punishment, sacrifice, and the ultimate act of ritualistic cleansing. We're going to look at the bog body and ritual sacrifice, and the theory that some of these ancient, well-preserved bodies were not victims of murder, but of ritualized punishment. Imagine the landscape of Ireland not just as a place of rolling hills and ancient stones, but as a vast, dark and mysterious bog. These bogs are more than just wetlands. They're a kind of time capsule, a preserving medium that has held the secrets of the past for thousands of years. From time to time, these bogs give up their dead, the incredibly well-preserved bodies of men and women who lived and died in a time we can barely comprehend. These are the bog bodies, and their serene, often brutal deaths are a source of endless fascination and scholarly debate. Now, look at one of these bog bodies, a man whose last moments were a mystery until his body was found. His hair is still intact, his skin still bears the marks of his life, but his death was violent. He was strangled, or perhaps his throat was cut, and he was thrown into the bog. Was he a murder victim? Perhaps. But a new and deeply chilling theory has emerged. What if he wasn't just a murder victim, but a criminal? A man who had committed a crime so vile that the community needed to make a statement, not just to the living, but to the gods themselves. The theory is that some of these bog bodies were the victims of ritualistic punishment, a kind of ultimate final sentence for the most heinous of crimes. The man wasn't just killed. His death was a carefully choreographed ritual, a way of appeasing the gods and cleansing the community of his crime. He might have been ritually strangled to sever the spiritual life force from his body, and then thrown into the bog, a liminal space between the living and the dead, a place that was believed to be the home of the gods. His death wasn't just about a physical end. It was about a spiritual one, a way of ensuring that his spirit would never return to haunt the living, a way of making him disappear from the face of the earth, both physically and spiritually. A mainstream historical fact is that the bog bodies have been found all over Europe, not just in Ireland, and their deaths were often incredibly violent and ritualistic. Many of them show signs of a ritualistic death, a kind of human sacrifice that was practiced by the Iron Age Celts and other pagan cultures. The bodies are often found naked, with signs of a violent death, and they are often found with no possessions, a sign that they were not just a random victim of a crime, but a person who had been stripped of their identity and their worldly possessions. The bog was the ultimate final resting place for a person who had been erased from the face of the earth. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a fascinating detail about the diet of some of the bog bodies. The analysis of their stomachs shows that their last meal was often a specific kind of bread, a kind of symbolic final meal that was often eaten as a part of a pagan ritual. This suggests that the people who were sacrificed or punished were not just a random victim. They were a person who had been ritually prepared for their death, a person who had been given a final, symbolic meal before they were sent to the gods. It was a bizarre and specific ritual, a final act of a community that was both brutal and deeply spiritual. And here we come to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the bog bodies were criminals, kings, or something else entirely. Were they a form of ritualistic punishment for the most heinous of crimes? Or were they kings who were sacrificed to the gods to ensure the fertility of the land? Or were they just a random victim of a terrible crime? The truth, as always, is a murky mix. But it's a debate that gets to the heart of what the ancient Irish believed and what they feared most. The bog bodies are a silent testament to a world that was both deeply spiritual and incredibly brutal. A world where the line between punishment and sacrifice was a very thin one. You look at the bog, a vast and mysterious landscape that has held its secrets for thousands of years. The man, a criminal, a king, a sacrifice, lies in its dark depths, a silent monument to a world that is long gone. His punishment wasn't a fine, a banishment, or a physical brand. It was a final, terrible act of ritualistic cleansing, a way of ensuring that his spirit would never return, a way of making him disappear from the face of the earth. The bog was the ultimate final resting place, and the bog body was the ultimate final punishment, a testament to a world where the laws of man and the laws of the gods were one and the same, and that in itself is a terrifying and final verdict. You've just peered into the dark, watery grave of a bog body, a silent and chilling testament to a form of justice that was both ritualistic and final. You've journeyed through a world governed by Brehon laws, where honour was a currency, shame a weapon, and the supernatural was an ever-present force. We've seen punishments as bizarre as a cursed well, and as terrifying as a personal taboo. Now let's bring it all back home, to the quiet, lingering echo of these ancient laws and the legacy they've left on Irish culture and legal systems today. Imagine the flickering light of the peat fire, the chieftain's hall, the Brehon's pronouncements. All of it is long gone. The great halls are now ruins, the chieftains are a matter of history books, and the Brehons are just a footnote in a long-dead legal tradition. The Brehon laws, which were meticulously memorised and passed down for centuries, were slowly and systematically replaced by Norman and later English common law. The oral tradition gave way to the written word, the communal system to the centralised state. But the laws didn't just disappear. They faded, but they left a deep and lasting imprint on the soul of Ireland. The Brehon laws faded not in a single, cataclysmic moment, but through a slow process of attrition. As Norman invaders and later the English crown asserted their power, they brought their own legal systems with them. The Brehons and their laws were seen as a threat to the new order, a symbol of a stubborn, rebellious culture that refused to be assimilated. The Brehons were outlawed, their schools were shut down, and their legal texts were often destroyed. The ancient legal system, a masterpiece of social engineering, was deemed barbaric by the new rulers, and it was replaced with a system that was, in many ways, far more brutal and less concerned with restitution and social balance. But the legacy of the Brehon laws, that ancient strange legal system, never truly died. It was absorbed into the culture, woven into the fabric of Irish society. The concept of honour, of a person's good name being a thing of value, is still a powerful part of Irish culture today. The idea that a person's word, their oath, is a sacred thing is still deeply ingrained. Even the love of language, of a well-turned phrase or a biting insult, a remnant of the power of the poets, or fili, and their ability to bring about a curse, is still a part of the culture. The laws might be gone, but the spirit of them, that strange and beautiful way of looking at the world, is still alive. A mainstream historical fact is that the Brehon laws are a priceless source of information for historians today. They are a treasure trove of information about the daily life, social structure, and legal thought of ancient Ireland. They tell us about everything from the price of a cow to the legal rights of a woman, and they show us a world that was far more sophisticated and complex than the new rulers gave it credit for. The Brehon laws are not just a legal text. They are a window into a world that is long gone, and they are a testament to the sophistication of ancient Irish thought. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a fascinating tradition known as the Crooked Mile, a kind of folk memory of the crooked judgment. It's a phrase often used today to describe a situation where a person is forced to do something unfair or unjust, a kind of modern echo of the old Brehon laws. The idea that a person's moral failings can have a physical or social consequence is still a part of the culture, even if the actual physical punishment is long gone. It's a beautiful and terrible example of how a deep and ancient belief can survive for centuries, even in the face of a new and powerful culture. And here we come to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the true nature of the transition from the Brehon laws to English common law. Was it a complete and total replacement? A kind of legal and cultural genocide? Or was it a more gradual process of assimilation, where the old laws were absorbed and reinterpreted by the new system? Some scholars argue that the Brehon laws were so different from English common law that a synthesis was impossible. Others contend that the old laws continued to be practiced in secret for centuries, a kind of underground legal system that was a quiet act of rebellion against the new rulers. It's a debate that gets to the heart of what it means to lose a culture, and what it means to fight to keep it alive. So here we are at the end of our journey. The ancient laws might be gone, but the spirit of them, that strange and beautiful way of looking at the world, is still alive. The punishments we've explored, from the public shaming to the ritualistic sacrifice, were not just a series of bizarre acts. They were a reflection of a world where every action had a consequence, every word had a power, and every person's place in the world was a delicate and fragile thing. The laws might be gone, but the legacy of them, that deep and abiding belief in the power of honour, of shame, and of the supernatural is still with us. It's in the stories we tell, the phrases we use, and the way we look at the world. The laws might be gone, but the spirit of them is still a part of the air we breathe. The fire is now a bed of glowing embers. The shadows have softened. The journey is over. The punishments, the rituals, the strange laws, they're just stories now, echoes of a time that is long gone. They're not a threat to you. The world you live in is a different one, a world of locked cells and written laws. The spectre of the Brehon and the Druid has faded into a quiet, sleepy hum. You can let go now.